Welcome to the Audience Connection.
Brought to you by Casual, the video partner for global brands. With offices in the US, EMEA, and APAC,
Casual leverages the art and science behind creating impactful stories to drive business results for their clients.
we're your hosts. I'm Lydia Chan.
And I'm Ollie Atkinson. This is the Audience Connection. Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Audience Connection. I'm Ollie, and I am here with Liz. Hey Liz, how you doing?
Hey, Ollie. Really great to jump into this episode. You had Phill Agnew on, who is the host of the Nudge podcast, which is one of the top-ranked marketing podcasts.
Indeed, yeah. So Phill is a master at turning complex behavioral science principles into practical ideas that you can just take out and execute and apply to your work. And it was fascinating to have a conversation with him. And actually, we talked for so long and it was so engrossed by it. We actually cut this up and turn it into two parts.
Yeah, and I think what's so great about it for us, for the audience, is it's just the practical advice. You know, as creators, as marketers, people sometimes just need to do it, right? And they need to, understand the science, the principles, the theories. But at the end of the day, let's apply it and stop overthinking, right? And, really test these things in the market.
Completely. And testing is all a big part of it. And the first part, we talk about two main principles, really. And Phill has loads of different stories around them. But there's the labor illusion and the curiosity gap. And that's all about grabbing attention and hooking your audience in. And the second part is more about storytelling. It's about how do you turn that attention into action? How do you change behavior once you've captured someone's attention? So two parts, do listen to the first before you listen to the second, but they're both as valuable as each other.
Yeah. And if you guys want to learn more about what those things are, stay tuned. So let's dive into the episode with Ollie and Phill Agnew.
Phill, welcome to the show.
Hi, Ollie. Thank you so much for having me. And excited to talk a bit about the psychology of video.
Yeah, brilliant. Yeah, I'm really excited too. And as you say, it's good to see how this is all rolled out with a lens over video. So I'd like to take a step back before we start diving into the principles and talk a bit about just behavior science in general. So obviously, consumer marketing has become even more popular. The science behind it more popular over the last 10 years. There feels like there's a real buzz around behavior science across lots of different industries at the moment. But are they actually new, or has this all been around for a long time?
Yeah, it does feel that way, doesn't it? It feels like more of the content you see if you're scrolling through LinkedIn, X, or wherever you choose to get your content from. There's more and more people, talking about principles, social proof, curiosity gap, reciprocity, fancy names for things that probably all of us know already and don't need to be termed. But this stuff isn't new. It's not new. I mean, you could argue it goes all the way back to the ancient Greek philosophers who would talk about things like hedonic treadmills and why we don't feel pleasure if we continue to consume pleasurable things. That's psychology, and psychology is old as the age, old as time, really, and it goes back a long time. And specifically, behavioral science, behavioral economics is relatively new, but the study of how people make decisions is very old. I mean, hundreds of years at least. We have been studying why people make certain decisions in certain ways, and really, that is what consumer psychology, if you're looking at it from a marketing lens, or behavioral science, if you're looking at it from a more global lens, that is what it's about. It is about understanding why people make the decisions they do, and by using that understanding to potentially encourage people to watch more of your video or click on your video in the first place. And all of us who are listening to the podcast, talking in this podcast, we are in the industry of influencing people's decisions. Just in this podcast alone, we will try and create a title that makes people want to listen to it, because why else would we be doing this if we didn't do that in the first place? And that is, in some ways, something that can be influenced by psychology, influenced by this understanding of psychology. So no, it's not a new thing. It's something that's been around for a long time. But I think we live in an age at the moment where there's lots of AI, there's lots of quick wins. People are looking for an easy answer. And I think what psychology does is it helps ground us, and it says, no, there are laws and principles that the majority of people follow when they're making a decision. If you understand these laws and principles, you'll be able to nudge them in the right direction.
Mm. And I suppose AI has it's sort of opened it up, these principles, to everyone as well. They're no longer buried in psychology white papers where, you can actually just go on to GPT or whichever one you use and ask about them and see how they could be applied. I've certainly done a lot of that since, looking at researching this. So that can be a real help, really. It makes it more accessible.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, it can be. It can be. I think there's a lot of there's a lot in the industry at the moment about if you ask AI for research papers, you'll get very bad results. It doesn't seem to
really?
be as linked up as you would hope it would be. You say, "Oh, can you find me something to cite how important social proof is?" And it gives you a medical journal about you know curing the common cold or something. It's like, okay, well, that's not relevant at all. But it will only get better. It will help people's understanding, and yeah, AI I think will level up people's intelligence in this area.
And you talk in your podcast about actually these principles aren't really applied as much as you might think in marketing or in internal, external communications. It's all about, as you said, influencing behavior. But talk a little bit about that. It's not you don't see it that all that frequently.
I mean, from a very personal point of view, this is quite surprising to me. So I studied. I was one of those people that actually studied marketing at university. What a nerd! What a reason. Didn't have many friends. So I studied marketing at university. I did a 4-year degree, and I went into my first marketing job. And you have this assumption. I've literally been studying the job for 4 years. A doctor studies for a bit longer than that, but they are allowed to work on patients after they've finished studying. I had this assumption that I should be pretty good at marketing, right? I've literally been training in this, and what I found so interesting was when I went into my first job, all of the tasks I were given, I felt like I had basically no training for whatsoever. So I'd been learning about things like the 4Ps, SWOT analysis, why most mergers and acquisitions fail. And obviously, you go into marketing, the first job is not pick a merger and acquisition, Phil.
No,
Good
no,
luck.
no, no.
It's
Yeah,
write a blog title, write an email subject line that people will open, come up with a tweet that will get more likes and shares, write a one pager that will work for the client we're looking at, help create a slide deck. All of these things that were so tactical and small that I realized I had almost no knowledge of how to do it whatsoever. I had this strategic knowledge, which would maybe be useful at some point in my career, but I had none of the tactical knowledge that I needed to influence people's careers. And I'll be honest with you, I was a bad marketer for the first few years of my career. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what to write. God knows what I should put in a newsletter to make people read it. And that was until I sort of stumbled upon the world of behavioral science. I think I watched a talk by Richard Shotton. We did some work with him, read his book, read Rory Sutherland's work, checked out Influence by Robert Cialdini, all these wonderful things. And suddenly it was through behavioral science and consumer psychology that I started to learn principles that actually helped me with the day-to-day job of marketing, actually gave me some advice as to what I should title that blog header or what I can put in that email to make people more likely to open it. Because what that is all about is subtly influencing people's decisions with proven principles that work. So for marketing, it is interesting for me how little it's talked about in the marketing space because I've stumbled upon this. It wasn't like people in the marketing team were saying, "You know what, folks, we really need to be using loss aversion in the email today," or "Let's really try and use the noble edge effect in this," or "Let's redo the pricing page in terms of anchoring." It's sort of not there. I think it's because it's one of the things that it is a part of university studies, but it's not really something we're taught about, and it also just seems a bit intimidating. It's like so many massive words, so many papers you have to read, so many people you have to cite. And one of the things I've been doing, we're now just trying to take this slightly intimidating insights and studies that are within sort of the densest, most impossible journals you could ever imagine reading. This thing that literally will put you to sleep if you read it, even 9 a.m. in the morning after a cup of coffee. Taking that and actually explaining it in a way which makes it easier for us marketers to understand and apply to our job.
yeah. Just taking those salient points, and then you can start to apply little bits, and we'll come on to how like some practical ways to apply this. But I guess that presents a huge opportunity, right? So if there's not as much awareness as you might expect, then if you start applying some of these principles to your work, you'll start to see a real improvement. And you've used that to grow Nudge, right? Like you've really been using these, and I see in your newsletters and in your content that there's very clear principles at play there. Um, So let's get into it. I think I'd love to start with my favorite of the principles, and that is the labor illusion. And that is my favorite because, in producing work, we are going out, crews are going out, there's a lot of moving parts. And really, what you're doing with this is you're lifting the curtain and showing people what you're doing. And I won't go into it too much. Please tell us about the labor illusion and why it's so powerful.
Yeah, so let me start with a boring study. So please don't fall asleep as I talk you through this. I'll try and make it as interesting as
I'm
possible.
going already.
I could just see you drifting off there. No, listen, this is interesting. Imagine you're buying a house. Well, don't imagine because people were actually buying a house in this study, but just picture yourself buying a house. And this is sort of a few years back before Rightmove and all of that. And you go to the estate agent and you ask for a list of properties to buy, is what people used to do. And the estate agent gives you a list. Now, they in the study creating variants. In every study, there needs to be basically a randomized control trial. There was 2 variants and usually a control, and people are randomly put into one of those variants. So one of the variants, one of the options you could see, so to speak, is a list of houses. And the list in both cases was identical, except when the real estate agent handed over the house, a list of houses, they said, this I've actually spent a long time working on. I've really looked at your interests, and I spent about 8 hours yesterday working on this list of 20 houses for you. I hope you really like them. And then in the other variant, the estate agent hands it over and says, I really thought about your interests. This took me about 18 minutes to put together yesterday, but it should be perfect for you. The houses in both scenarios are the same. So they're not seeing different houses, better houses. The researchers basically measured how much that one line saying I spent 8 hours or 18 hours differed the actual decisions of the home buyers, because it's such a huge thing to buy a home. You would think
Mm.
that that should have no difference whatsoever. And yet it did. When people hear that that list took hours to create, they were far more likely to view the homes, far more likely to put an offer on the home, far more likely to buy the home. Something as insignificant as simply hearing that someone has spent 8 hours finding a house for you could change your life. You could literally end up going to a different house. Your kids end up going to a different school. They end up marrying someone different. All this sort of thing. Bit of butterfly effect in there as well. And this is all from this idea of the labor illusion. And this is specifically an illusion because in this example, the real estate agent hadn't put any extra time. It was 8 minutes in both scenarios, 18 minutes in both scenarios. It was an illusion. There's a slight difference to this, which perhaps I prefer because I don't like the idea of lying to people about how much time you put in, which is known as the input bias, which is very specifically the more time you put into something, the more people value it. And we see this in all sorts of ways. There's an element of it in something like subways design. So researchers, Buell and Norton, ran studies in Boston. It wasn't in subway, it was in a cafeteria. And they measured how willing people were to pay for sandwiches. It wasn't a subway, but it was close enough. When either people saw the sandwich being made, so it was subway style in front of you, you could see them make the sandwich, or it was made behind a sort of opaque glass, so you couldn't see the sandwich being made. What they found consistently is when you can see the product being made, you pay more for it, more likely to buy it, and you enjoy it more as well. They went on to do studies at actual restaurants where they made the glass to the kitchen either see-through, so the diners could see the chefs and the chefs could see the diners, or they made it opaque. Same thing happens. The diners enjoy the meal more when they can see it being made. What's really interesting as well is the chefs enjoy cooking even more too, because they can see people enjoying their meal. So they call this operational transparency. If you're transparent about your operations, it seems to benefit not only the consumer, but the maker as well. And the takeaway we can have if you're creating work, creating content, creating videos is actually showcasing the effort you've put into something, showcasing behind the scenes tends to make people appreciate that even more. Very quick example, I like to apply this stuff myself to prove that it works for me. One of the ways I do that is with Reddit ads, very quick, dirty, easy way to run a A/B test. I had an end of year episode where I'd interviewed a bunch of people. At the end of the year, I combined all the best bits from that episode. My variant, my control was learn the 6 best marketing techniques I've heard over the past year. Put that on a Reddit ad, send it out. And then in my variant, I use the input bias. I say something truthful. I say, I've spent 480 minutes this year interviewing the best marketing leaders about their advice. Here are the 6 best bits of advice that they have. And then I compared the clicks and the click-through rate on both. And it turns out that the input bias variance, saying I've spent 480 minutes doing something, made people 45% more likely to click that ad,
That's quite high, isn't
drive
it?
a fairly big amount. I
Yeah.
mean, general numbers weren't massive, and it's not the biggest result. And these are sort of quick, dirty studies that I've run. They're not scientifically proven, but it proved it for me. And it's this idea that, just saying I've spent 480 minutes made people far more likely to become a subscriber, far more likely to listen, massively improved my ad.
When we produce a film, and especially if it's a studio film or something where we're doing a large production, we will produce a behind the scenes film for free for the client. And then we can use that in our marketing, but it's amazing how the sort of goodwill that generates with the clients. And then if the employees are in the film as well, I remember we did one where there was a giant mannequin challenge around the office, and they did a bit, and I think that's such a powerful, and those behind the scenes films perform better on social sometimes than the actual films themselves. And I guess that moves slightly into the IKEA effect as well, does it? If they're
It can.
involved in
It can.
building, does that?
Well,
Yeah.
well, that makes me think of. I think that's fascinating that you say they can perform even better. It makes me think this is incredible. This is a real story about Starbucks. The baristas at Starbucks got very good at what's called parallel pouring, and that meant that a single barista. And this is important for Starbucks because there's often queues out the door. This was about 2010 as well, so this is well before app ordering. You had to go
Mm.
to the barista, ask what you'd want, and they'd make it for you. And they were trained in what was called parallel pouring, which essentially meant that they could prepare 4 different coffees in one go. So you get 4 cups underneath 2 of the nozzles. You've got the espresso coming out. You've got a big jug of milk, and you can do 4 in one go. An economist would look at this and say, "This is genius. This is genius. We're going to reduce those queues. People get served quicker. They'll be happier." Total opposite happened. Sales started to drop where baristas were doing parallel pouring. People's perception of quality dropped as well. What they found was the process was literally happening too quickly. There was something psychological in our minds where it's like when we see our drink being made that quickly alongside 4 other drinks, suddenly some of the magic goes out of it. It's
Right.
the time it takes, the input, the effort that is put into the drink that actually justifies the value that we've spent on it. And it wasn't until they banned Starbucks, banned their baristas from doing this parallel pouring. You could only make 2 cups of coffee at once now. You can't make 4. And then they saw that sales increases, enjoyment of the drink went up as well. And you know this, we all know this. If somebody cuts your hair and they do it in 4 minutes, they just sort of
Mm.
speed through it.
You
And then
feel
you look at your
cheated.
haircut at the end, you're not going to enjoy it as much as if they spent 40 minutes laboring over it,
Yeah.
even if it's the exact same haircut. And I think the same is true for your behind the scenes footage of you can really picture the CEO who maybe wasn't involved in the creation of that video, watching the behind the scenes footage and thinking, oh, okay, this agency is the real deal. I can see the 5 people they had on set. I can see the different camera operators they had. I can see the producers sweating over getting the right shot. When I see the effort that's gone into it, I'll value it far more. If you just send them the final cut, it's a bit like pouring 4 coffees at once. It's like, okay, yeah, this is good, but have we been shortchanged? have they
Yeah.
have they done this quickly? Were they making 4 other videos at the same time? And I think the behind the scene footage can really help. It's slightly different from the IKEA effect we can get into, but it's a great idea.
Okay. And then the other example I had on that, in fact, I was doing this yesterday. We've tried to we're doing some new marketing activities. We've seen digital marketing drift a little bit and not be as effective. So we sent out a load of postcards, about 800 postcards to potential clients. Nothing, really, like barely anything. And so we got these little, I have one on my desk, it's gone, but we had these little video cards. And for that, and I'm doing this 300 times, and I know you watch 300 ads, so you'll know how exhausting it is to do 300 anything. And so like I'm doing 300 pieces to camera, which is a personal introduction to that person, why we want to work with them, and then a specific industry reel. And essentially all the moisture disappeared from my mouth yesterday from all the talking I was doing. But I think there's something in like, and I go back to like your, the example when you walked 60 kilometers to that conference and there were blisters on your feet, but there was a really rewarding beer in the pub afterwards and it looked like you really enjoyed it. So towards the end of these recording these messages, I was sort of drifting slightly and finding it quite painful. But is the amount that you're showing you're enjoying something relevant to making this a really effective principle?
It is, yeah. For the listeners who are thinking, what the hell do you mean you walked to a conference? For a conference that I went to, Creator Day, brilliant conference down in Poole in the south of the UK, I decided to walk 60 kilometers there rather than pay for the train because I'm a cheapskate. It's not only that. Main reason was that. Anyway, I walked there, and then my presentation was all about the psychology of effort, which is something you and I have just been talking about, interweaved with this incredible story about my walk. The blisters I got, literally, these blisters were hanging off my feet. They had their own gravity, and all the things I saw on the way, these sort of different stories I encountered along it, and all of that was to basically show that I put a lot of effort in. And there's this principle within psychology called costly signaling, which I think really refers to what you were telling me earlier about this video, which is that the cost and the effort and the expense that goes into creating your message directly equals the value that people will get out of reading your message, and the significance and weight that they associate to that message. So the best way to describe this is, imagine you want to propose to your partner. You could hire a Rolls Royce, have that Rolls Royce take you to a 5-star Michelin restaurant, eat a tasting menu with the wine. On the way home, stop at Tower Bridge. You've rented out the top of Tower Bridge. You go up, you get down on one knee, and you propose. I know someone who did that, actually. Waste of money. No, you could do that, and the likelihood that your partner will say yes should be quite high. You could also rent an Uber and go to McDonald's and head down on one knee just as you're picking up a fry off the floor and propose there. It's still the same.
I think I know someone who did that, actually.
Someone who did that. Yeah, my partner. No, it's still the same offer. You're still committing to spend the rest of your life with this person, and yet obviously the likelihood of that person saying yes is dramatically different, and that's because of costly signaling. The more effort you put into the message, and there's a wonderful study done with Korean e-commerce websites which proved this with handwritten notes. So they sent everybody who had bought an item off this e-commerce website, I think it was a makeup brand, they sent them either, and it was run with these researchers, so it was all done professionally. They sent them either a postcard essentially, which had printed text on it, so just basically Times New Roman, and it just said thank you for their orders, we appreciate you as a customer, that sort of thing. Or they sent them a handwritten version. Now, what's interesting is the handwritten version was still printed, so it was perceived, it was a bit of an illusion because it was still printed. But it looked handwritten, it looked signed by the CEO, that sort of thing, and they sent that. And then they measured their future purchases afterwards, and what they found was those who received the thank you note in Times New Roman spent on average $29 over the next month. Those who received the thank you note that appeared to be handwritten spent something like $54. Because handwritten notes take a lot more time to create, we value them more. Final example of this is a wonderful Rory Sutherland example. He shared this news story about a couple who were desperate to buy a house on a single street somewhere in the UK. They just fell in love with the street. They wanted their kids to go to the local school. The only problem was nobody on the street was selling their house. Nobody had even sold their house within the last 5 years. It was very unlikely they were going to be able to buy a house on that street. So you could obviously just, knock on the door, say, "Oh, are you selling a home?" Or you could just ask the real estate agent. They wrote a handwritten individual note to every single resident on that street, explaining why they wanted to live there, how their kids would enjoy that home in particular. They put an awful lot of effort into the communication, posted that through the letterbox. I think 5 people invited them to come and view the house. 3 accepted offers. 3 accepted, asked them to put offers on. 2 actually accepted their offers. So they had a choice of 2 houses and they ended up picking one. And it's this incredible story of, like, sometimes we assume as marketers, we're told we have to be as efficient as possible. We have to reach the most amount of people in the most effective way. Everything has to be automated and AI generated and fast and efficient, and we should save time. And what this almost suggests is that sometimes the total opposite can be true. Sometimes making a lot of effort, creating something handwritten, creating these video messages like you were yesterday, will actually resonate in a way that the typical message never would.
Where's the sweet spot between something polished and quite finished, and then something where you've shown all the bones and you've kind of really shown the effort that's gone into it?
I mean, it will dramatically depend on the type of industry you're in, who you're selling to, who you are, I think. the showing the bones works really well for personable agencies with few people, and you know the people behind it, and you can see the individuals there. I think if Pepsi showed the bones with a Super Bowl ad, it would be like, hold on, aren't
Yeah.
you a multi-billion pound company with like 5,000 staff? Couldn't you correct that typo? So it definitely works better for others. But all of that said, there is this principle within psychology which is known as the Pratfall Effect. Kind of silly name for something which I think is actually really important. It was discovered by Elliot Aronson, who's this sort of legendary researcher. He's been researching all these wonderful principles over the years. And his study is really simple. He filmed a quiz participant answering quiz questions. The participant was actually an actor. They always lie in these studies, but anyway, the viewers of the video didn't notice. So they filmed the quiz participant. The quiz participant gets every question to almost every question right. So what's the capital of Mauritius? They get it right. How many colors are there in the flag of the Philippines? They get that right immediately. All these difficult questions that you wouldn't necessarily know the answer to. The quiz participant gets it right, and then they film that. Quiz participant comes off stage, and then for one group of the people watching the video, Elliot Aronson cuts the video there, and they only see the quiz participant answering all those questions correctly. For another group, he keeps the camera rolling for a bit longer. You watch the participant come off stage, drink a cup of coffee, and clumsily spill all this coffee down their shirt. They've got this huge brown stain. What a fool. What an idiot. Now, at the end of the experiment, two groups are shown those two versions of the video. They're both asked, how likable is that quizzer? How likable are they? You would assume that the one who was clumsy would be seen as less likable.
Mm.
There's no reason why I should want a friend who might spill coffee down me, or might clumsily get ketchup on me as we're sort of eating in the pub, or might nick the car I'm driving because clumsy isn't an attractive trait. And yet what Aronson finds is that those who see the clumsy quizzer, who is very smart because they've answered all those questions correctly, they actually rate that person as far more likable than the same quizzer who they didn't see the clumsiness element. And what he finds, and this is repeated through lots of different studies, is that when you start to show a weakness, when you reveal a flaw, you're seen as more likable. Jo Swinson, I think, from Cardiff University, Welsh University, she replicated this idea, but with CVs and job applications. She got her research assistants to send two CVs to thousands of different jobs, and the CVs were almost identical, except one would always highlight a flaw, whereas one would only talk about the strengths. And she measured how many of these CVs got responses, got invited back for the interviews, and she found something like 60%, a huge increase in the number of return calls when they mention a weakness. It seems irrational, but actually human psychology is a bit complex, and actually what we find is that when people seem totally flawless, we actually start to dislike them, and that's why it can be so powerful. And we know it works for small brands, we know it works for small agencies to show behind the scenes, show the blooper reel, that sort of thing, but it also works for big brands if it's used effectively. Marmite, you either love it or you hate it. They specifically call out the idea that some people might not like it. Buckley's cough medicine, they talk about the flavor being disgusting. That's sort of part of the allure. Red Bull literally doesn't taste nice. In the taste tests, when they launched it, every single person said this doesn't taste nice. But that's sort of why it works, because people perceive it to be far more potent because it doesn't taste good. If it was
Right.
more sugary, if it was nicer, you wouldn't assume you're getting the same caffeine hit. My favorite example of this is a dual-paged magazine ad for Snowbird Ski Resort, I believe it is, in the US. Incredible ad, big picture of the ski resort. In the bottom left, you see the only text on the copy is a review, and it says 1 star, way too technical. I wasn't able to finish the run. What an interesting ad. 1 star, promoting your 1-star ad. Well, it works because what they're trying to actually do is target highly skilled skiers. And by showcasing that flaw, that some people won't be able to do it, they're actually going to come across as more likable, better, that sort of thing. And so this is why it can work. I think the only advice you have to bear in mind is to match your strength with a weakness. Elliot Aronson repeated the experiment. He got the same quizzer to go back on stage and answer questions. He said this time they got all the questions wrong. They didn't know how many colors there were in the Philippines flag. They didn't know what the capital of Mauritius was. They got all that wrong. And then they went off stage and they spilled coffee down themselves. And now, when that person is asked how likable they are, they're actually seen as less likable when they seem poor at the quiz and they spill coffee down themselves than when they only seemed poor at quizzing in the first place. So if you match a weakness with a weakness, it doesn't work. If you match a
Interesting.
strength with a weakness, it works. Marmite is you either love it or you hate it. It's
Yeah.
not you'll hate it or you'll definitely hate it. That wouldn't work. It has to be a strength with a weakness.
I think years and years ago, I used to run comedy clubs, and I used to see comedians. These are professional level comedians, but everyone has bad gigs, right? And that's really interesting, that idea, because they would be car crashing, zero laughs, no one would be laughing at all, and then they just turn on themselves and use that self-deprecating humor. This is not going very well. This is rubbish, and then that then lifted the whole thing, and everyone loved them. And by the end of it, there was encores, and they were kind of coming back on. So yeah, I can see how that balance works. I guess they weren't really performing that well when they were doing it in the first place, but
Yeah.
yeah.
But self-deprecation, as we all know about. I heard a comedian joke the other day, and like I don't know if this is correct at all, but he was like, every to be a comedian, you have to be ugly. You have to be ugly. You can't be attractive. And I was thinking about it. I was like, come on, that's not true. And then I started to think about all the comedians I know. And I was like, I know all the comedians I've watched. I was like, yeah, you know, they're not male models. They're not
No,
male models. You're
no,
not going to have DiCaprio being a comedian. You're going to have Bill Murray. Like, there is something along this idea that we to laugh at someone is to laugh with someone, which is what a comedian wants you to do, is a great show of appreciation. You really likability is through the roof, and that likability is harder to reach if they're perfect. It's like you can't also be a
completely.
male model or a female model. I think you also have to have a slight flaw in order to be a
Yeah,
comedian.
yeah, yeah, and you saw that a lot of actors coming through and doing comedy when they sort of not they're resting, and they didn't do as well. And actually, my brother's a comedian, so I'm going to tell him that that's going to be quite fun.
It's butt ugly.
Yeah, exactly. Just by the way,
Congratulations.
Phill Agnew thinks you're butters. Okay, so if we're like, so if effort and that builds trust, if like we're thinking about um how to get that hook and how to get people interested in our content in the first point, what do we use there? This is the curiosity gap, right? This is how we get people interested in the first place. Tell us a bit about the curiosity gap.
Yeah, so this is the idea of, okay, we've created a video. How do we, or a podcast, or an email
Mhm.
newsletter, or a blog, or a product? How do we get people interested in it? What psychologists consistently find is when there is a gap in the information somebody has, they'll be more interested in learning about that information, even if the information is highly irrelevant. So, in studies, if you're told, I'm going to keep using geography examples, I have no idea why. I've clearly woken up with thinking about capital cities. If you're told the capital of Portugal is either Lisbon or Porto, and you have to sort of guess, you'll be far more likely to remember what the capital is than if you are just told it's Lisbon. I'm now seriously worried it's not Lisbon. I assume it is. Clearly, I should have done this test before. But I spoke to a memory expert, and this is a really powerful. I now use it all the time. If you want to remember something, try and guess it first, because when you guess something, your brain is more likely to hold on to it. So if information is left out and is not visible to us, we'll be far more likely to engage with it, far more likely to remember it. The way this can be applied is by using these different hooks. I spoke to Bas Wouters, a Dutch behavioral scientist, on my podcast. He said there's all these different words you can use in your title to make it more engaging. So he said he ran a test with a blogging company, and the company had a blog or a case study, which was something like um, AI's automation will change the way we work. And he said that's not a good title. The reason that's not a good title is you're not hiding any information there. AI's automation will change the way we work.
Mm.
There's nothing hidden there. You're sort of giving the answer. He changed that title, and I will clarify that I'm butchering the title. None of this is exact, but it's the right idea. He changed it to "This will change the way you work." So it's adding this thing. So you're saying there is something specific that I can learn. There's something concrete that I can get, but I don't know what it is just then. And when he tested that, I think he increased the open rate by 40%. I then tested that exact principle on my newsletter. I think I had two newsletters, one which said the pointless change that increased sales by 30%. And I then just changed it to this pointless change increased sales by 10%. And it's something about the word this, something about hiding something from people that makes it more engaging. Mine wasn't just Curiosity Gap, it was testing this thing as well. And you might look at this and think, Phill, this is clickbait. This is BuzzFeed. This is rubbish. Like, don't tell me this. I don't need to know this. People are smarter than that. And I think there are ways you can apply this, which is really poor. And I think you can look at clickbait, Facebook, BuzzFeed, those sorts of articles. But you could also go back and look at the works of Shakespeare or Charles Darwin. And if you look at those words, you'll see that those authors clearly understood Curiosity Gap, because what Shakespeare, a lot of this is very interesting about Shakespeare. A lot of his plays aren't his own. A lot of his storylines he has taken. There are storylines which have sort of been in theatre and literature for a long time. He took them and he made one change. He made the intrigue not visible at the start. So originally in these stories, someone would come on stage and the narrator would clearly explain everyone's motivations. Would clearly explain exactly what was going on. This is what is going to happen. Watch.
A professional spoiler just comes on, spoils it, and then goes off.
Yeah, he took that away. You don't know what will happen to Romeo and Juliet. You don't know what will happen to Macbeth. You don't know if Hamlet's mad. You don't know all of these things. And that's what makes it interesting. It's removing the information, adding that bit of curiosity that gets people engaged. And one final example, like I said, I like to test this myself. It's an unscientific test, but I think for your listeners, it'd be really interesting. I, at one stage of my career, wanted to get on TikTok. I'm now not on there, but I did think it could be a valuable place for me to grow my podcast. So I created a bunch of different TikTok videos, published them, put some ad spend behind them equally, and then tested how well they performed. Except, the bottom line here is I got, I think, 11,000 followers overall. So they did work. But I like experimented with the Curiosity Gap. So I literally created, I think it was 10 videos, some with the Curiosity Gap and some without. So the ones without would just start going into the content straight away. Social proof is a nudge you can use to make people more interested in yada, 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 yada. I just talk through the story. In the other one, I added one line at the start, which would hook people in. So rather than saying social proof can increase your copy effectiveness by 50%, I would say something like, this 2-word hack increases open rates by 50%, and then go into the story. Now, you can still look at it and say, Phill, that's clickbait. I don't like it. But those videos had, and I don't know the numbers, there is an episode you can go look up, which is called Ancient Storyteller, the ancient storytelling technique that I used to gain 11,000 TikTok followers. That's the one I created on it. That will have the exact numbers. But the bottom line is they got more views. They led to more people actually subscribing, more people actually becoming followers. They led to more people listening to the podcast. Everything was better for that. Adding one line, which hooked people in, which it alluded to the fact that there's information that they will get if they watch, but they do not know yet. It made them far more likely to keep watching.
Yeah. It takes me back to when I worked in broadcast as well, when you have researchers calling up and trying to get these contributors for documentaries, and they'd be, one of them was talking to this woman whose husband had been eaten by a shark on holiday, and she was like, and the researcher was saying, oh, we'll make this very sensitive and be treated really delicately. And then it goes back to the channel. I'm not going to say which channel it was, and the title they came up with was Eaten Alive on My Honeymoon. And so I remember hearing all these titles because the development teams were always focused on hooking the audience in. And so you're right, you can see it absolutely everywhere, and people like Mr. Beast, and you can see these creators that are fantastic at using this principle. When you go into the kind of more business world, I think there's an anxiety around, and we get this a lot with a brief, it's like, how do we cram in our positioning, our capability, our venue, and, absolutely everything into a film. And what would your advice be about the power of pulling back? Because there's an anxiety around, if I don't say everything and give all that information over, I'm going to lose my audience in that few seconds that I've got to grab them. What would your advice be on how to start to use this? Because there's definitely an education piece, I think, for people to get into using it.
My advice would be that it doesn't have to be emotionally charged. And it's something, what's ridiculous about My Husband Was Eaten on My Honeymoon is it's so visceral and so salient and so ridiculous.
Yeah. Yeah.
that like you can see why people dislike it. But what you learn, that's not all. That's sort of not the point of the curiosity gap. The curiosity gap doesn't say the most outrageous thing you can possibly think of in order to get people, while keeping something unknown in order to get people to click. It just says withhold some information. The information doesn't have to be emotionally charged or shocking. The example I gave of this 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 is changing the way we work versus AI automation is changing the way we work. It's you're never going to look at this as the way AI works and think, "Oh, what an awful title! How crass!" It's just it looks normal. And one of my favorite YouTubers at the moment, YouTubers understand this deeply. They have to.
Mm.
It's the only way you can survive on the platform. And I think studying popular channels on YouTube is probably the best way to understand how this works. And what you learn with YouTube is that, yes, there are the Mr. Beasts of this world who cater to, as far as I can tell, 11-year-olds and younger. But there are also creators who cater to people who actually want to learn something. And there's lots of people like this. There's a new YouTuber who's come out called Chris Spargo, I think his name is, and his hit video, the video that propelled him to fame, was one which is why do so many supermarkets in the UK have clock towers?
Good days. I mean, I want to watch that.
It is,
It's
and
really
like,
intriguing.
there's nothing emotionally charged in there. It's just
Mm.
they're posing a question. But the important thing is they're not giving away everything. It's not saying all UK supermarkets have clock towers because of this planning, because of a planning report in Essex back in the 1960s, which I think is a real answer. It's just hooking in people in with something interesting. And I think that's a great example because that shows to businesses, even B2B businesses, even multinational Dutch companies that only want to share the most perfectly legal thing they ever can, that you can still do that. You can still, if you're selling essential oils for flavoring, you don't have to say in your email to your potential suppliers that you really want people to open something which is, the most popular essential oil this year, according to our suppliers, is rose. You could say, learn what the most popular essential oil is to our supplier, even in industries where you have to be so focused on getting things legally correct. Of course, you can use the curiosity gap. Of course, you can withhold some information. And in fact, you should argue that you probably should, because if your goal as a marketer or whoever you are, business person, is probably to get people to actually engage with your content. If you're trying to do that and you're not leveraging a principle like this because you just assume it's BuzzFeed clickbait, you're probably missing the biggest lever you could ever pull to get people to actually read what you're spending so much effort on.
And how do you test? So obviously testing is really important if you're going to start rolling this out and seeing whether it's going to be more effective. Is there a gut feel, or is there a framework that you follow on how to test the effectiveness of these of the
You
gap?
should, I mean, yes, you should test. You should test as much as possible. If you're sending an email, you can do A/B tests. If you're creating a YouTube video, you can do thumbnail tests. You can post twice on some social media platforms, or just learn over time as you post. I think there are platforms you can use to test things. I think what I find interesting is that if you have based your decision on some fairly reliable behavioral science, and if you've gone into and understood the research, you've read about the study they've conducted, you've looked at the methodology, you've seen the results. At that sort of stage, I almost wonder if you have to test. Bas Wouters comes to me and he says, "Look, I improved this title by 50% by putting the word this in rather than AI automation." He has done the test. He has run the test. It worked for him. I did then go and test it on my newsletter, but I've also created a bunch of episodes on my podcast since then, which I'm not testing because I can't. There's no A/B test for a podcast title. I can't test that. But I'm happy with that because I know my decision isn't based off gut instinct. It is based off the results of someone else's test that's in a similar field. And I can assume that that applies. And in marketing, when I was starting out in marketing, there was so many decisions were made on what we thought was data, what we thought was reliable evidence, that really, when it came down to it, was just gut instinct. We were just basically going with things because we thought they would work. I think even if you're not able to test something, but you base it on something that has been tested by someone else, and statistically proven and done with a general population, not just sent by Nike to their loyal fans. You're going to really struggle to learn from Shoe Dog, for example,
Yeah,
like
yeah.
this one brand that happened to be successful. Elon Musk's autobiography really will not tell you how to make an EV car. Instead, if you've read a scientific study that has actually been run on the general public, I think even if you can't test, because in so many aspects of video you will never be able to test, it's a far better starting point to base your insight or your idea on that.
Have you ever kind of gone too far with it and not delivered? Is there something in you have to really kind of understand what's the value you're delivering after you're providing the gap and saying this is what you're going to get?
Hmm.
Or does
Well,
or do you keep it purposefully vague?
I do worry about that because I think both of us, we don't want to trick people. It's something I definitely have worried about over the last 6 years I've created a podcast. I have never, and I ask constantly for people to let me know what they think, and in newsletters, give me feedback. So I get a lot of feedback, both positive, both negative. I've had a number of 1-star reviews. You can go and read them if you like. But I've never had anybody ever say the title of this episode promised more than it delivered. I've never had anyone say
Okay.
that. And I think the interesting reason as to why that is, because I do try and use the curiosity gap, is probably once people have clicked on something, they're probably not thinking about the title anymore. It's just the title gets you in. And once they're in, suddenly it's all about your storytelling technique. And the best storytellers actually leverage the curiosity gap at intervals throughout the video. So you're constantly keeping people engaged by giving them enough information, but hinting that there's more to learn if they keep on going. So it's not something I would worry about unless, and goes back to this previous point, unless you're going for something so shocking, so emotional, so salient that it might actually anger people. Maybe you're going, this is, I guess, what you look at when you look at very polarized political takes on Twitter and things like that. Those types of messages are so shocking and so politicized and so polarized that you might say something linked to an article and it will be frustrating because it's like, okay, you've just made this ridiculous claim and then you're not able to back it up with any evidence whatsoever. So it's like the title does matter because the hook is actually the only thing of substance you've ever shared, and actually all of the real evidence for that doesn't exist. So I don't think that's a problem. The majority of the people listening to this, unless you want to be a populist leader and go for president in some Caribbean island or something. But I think the majority of people here aren't interested in that. They're just interested in creating content that people want to watch. And if you want to create content that people want to watch, of course, you should create a title that makes people interested. You should say, this is the reason why there are clock towers on your supermarkets. You shouldn't say why the reason is unless they watch the video, because that's the whole point.
Well, that's it for part 1 with Phill, and we've covered a lot, from storytelling shortcuts to the role of memory in persuasion, but we're not done yet. In part 2, we're going to go even deeper into the content that converts, why discomfort is sometimes your best creative tool, and how behavioral science might just future-proof your brand's storytelling. So hit follow, and we'll see you in the next episode.